Hello, my friends. It's day 276 of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. My name is Darren Gertis. I am a professor who's been tracking what's been going on day to day. So here, what we're going to do a couple of things. We're going to talk about all the articles daily, as we do every day, but we're going to look back into the past to kind of get a sense of what's going on in the future, and you'll understand by the time that we're done. So we're going to start here in this Radio Free Europe article, and prime ministers from Belgium, Lithuania, Poland arrive. There is a conference that is support for the Grain from Ukraine initiative that the Ukrainians are trying to get underway. Poland and Lithuania are two of maybe 4 or 5 of the most ardent supporters of Ukraine. And that's because they had the same root experience with the Soviets, and they don't ever want to deal with the Russians in the way that the Russians have oppressed them ever again. Another article about the same kind of thing. Zelensky speaks there and he says, Ukraine cannot be broken. Ukrainians went through very terrible things. Once they wanted to destroy us with hunger, now with darkness and cold. And he goes back and he harkens back, and this is where we go to the past, to the Holodomor. Zelensky and other leaders commemorated the victims of the Holodomor famine, which took place in 1933 as Stalin's police forced peasants in Ukraine to join collective farms by requisitioning their grain and other foodstuffs. Okay, requisitioning their grain sounds very sanitized. What they did was Stalin wanted to punish Ukrainians who were resistant to collective farms. They wanted to, they've always been on their own land, and they were kind of being pushed into collective farms in Soviet times. And what they did was they took all their food and then kept them in Ukraine and killed anyone who tried to get away. So millions of people died. It's estimated up to 9 million people died as a result of the executions, deportations, and starvation. So in one way or another, Stalin killed millions of Ukrainians in 1932, 1933. Okay, here is from the Holodomor Museum. Why do we call it genocide? On January 22nd, 1933, Stalin and Molotov signed a resolution that blocked Ukrainians inside the starving territory and forbade them to leave Ukrainian SSR to buy bread. Okay, where did they lock them in? In Ukraine. Ukraine is not just a political entity. This is the political geography that they're inside, and they locked them in that political geography. Now, these people who are Ukrainian now want to fight for that particular political ground, that real estate, and they do not want to be part of Russia. Russia never treated them like they were a part of Russia. Russia always treated them as something less than, and we see that historically. Okay, in other news, 6 million Ukrainians are still without electricity. Ukrainian repair crews are scrambling, trying to get power on. As of this evening, blackouts continue in most of Kyiv, but there is some good news. In Kherson, power is restored. Kherson was without power from November 11th, and power is now starting to be restored there. At the same time, let me look at this particular article. Zelensky is now put yourself in Zelensky's place. You're the leader of this country. Your country's being pounded, and he's kind of really frustrated with the things aren't getting done. Many Kyiv citizens were without electricity for more than 20 or even 30 hours, he said, on Friday evening. Winter is setting in. Cold, frost. Winter is going to kill Ukrainian citizens if they can't get this restored. So he's talking about he expects quality of work from the mayor's office, and remarks widely interpreted as a criticism of the mayor. The mayor's got to be frustrated too. They're just all on edge. It's not that he's bad or anything along those lines. They're just on edge. There is still work to be done in other areas, to say the least. The president added, the residents of Kyiv need more protection. And it's true. I can't imagine what it would be like to be in either one of their shoes and have the heavy burden of the responsibility of literally people will die from the cold and hunger and those kind of things. So it's just, wow. Here's another interesting article as well. One of Ukraine's largest hospitals nearly evacuated patients after Russian airstrikes cut the water supply. So think about this. One of Ukraine's largest hospitals was on the verge of evacuating. Just how difficult would it be? We were talking about earlier, what's it got to be like for Zelensky or the mayor of Kyiv? But think about all the logistics of the damage and destruction that's being done. Like, if you don't have electricity or you don't have water supply, how are you going to be able to deal with the patients in your hospital. People will die here because of electric being cut or water being cut, and you've got to be really careful with that. Okay, in other news, invasion. This was an interesting article because it was talking about Putin's calculus. So European history turned decisively on February when Russia invaded Ukraine. And we wondered what President Putin was really after while he went through the charade of threatening a full-scale invasion of a neighboring country. I remember thinking that too. I was at an academic conference the day before and then the day of the invasion. And the day before, we're like, nah, he's not going to do that. I was talking to colleagues in the cafeteria at school, talking about, like, he's just saber rattling. This isn't going to happen. And we're all surprised when he actually did. He was a natural bully who threatens and blusters and has nevertheless always been rather carefully calibrated. Surely he would not commit the manifest folly of trying to invade the biggest territory in Europe and 44 million people who didn't want to be Russian. There's a reason why they didn't want to be Russian, with fewer than 190,000 troops. But he did. And it was immediately clear that if Russia didn't win this war in the first 3 days, as it obviously intended, then it wouldn't win it. But Putin won't lose gracefully. An escalating, open-ended war in Europe is now upon us. And I thought that was a really interesting insight. Ukraine has done much since the 2014 conflict, when Crimea and a third of Donbass were seized by Russian forces and separatists. And they've been militarily preparing like never before. And they have been growing in their understanding and strategy. As Russian commander Sergei Sovakin has put it, I don't want to sacrifice a Russian soldier's lives again in a guerrilla war against hordes of fanatics armed by NATO. We have enough technical means to force Ukraine to surrender. No, actually you don't. So it's no longer, the author concludes, it's no longer about displacing Nazis and drug addicts in Kyiv or protecting the Russian speakers in Donbass. And there have been shifting sands of what they said their reasons were, and that's what he's talking about. For Moscow, the conflict is now officially what it was in reality back in February, a straightforward imperial conquest of its neighbor. And I think that's right. It's about taking over Ukraine, at least in a puppets kind of way, but preferably maximalist. It was never about protecting people in the Donbass. They're using people in the Donbass as cannon fodder, so that's not it either. Okay, Russia is firing aging cruise missiles because stocks are depleted, says the Ministry of Defense in Britain. So this was really fascinating. Russia's firing aging cruise missiles because their stocks are so depleted. The Ministry of Defense said, although such an inert system will produce some damage through missiles' kinetic energy and any unspent fuel, it's unlikely to achieve reliable effects against an intended target. So they took the nuclear warhead off, and they're just firing missiles like it's a big rock. It's almost like a catapult from the Middle Ages. Of course, there's going to be some fuel, whatever, but it's not going to have the same effect. But what's interesting is if you go to the Ministry of Defense, this is their daily intelligence update. Russia is likely removing the nuclear warheads. Russia almost certainly hopes such missiles will function as decoys and divert Ukrainian air defenses. So what they're doing is, as they're firing a bunch of them, they're hitting this one and that one, but one that's really powerful that's meant to hit the target hopefully will get through in the process. But they conclude, whatever Russia's intent, this improvisation highlights the level of depletion of Russia's stock of long-range missiles. Russia's really put itself in a hurt, and one of the last articles that I'm going to show you, well, not the last, but close to, is going to talk about exactly how. So hold on a second. In the meantime, there's this article that the West simply cannot supply the astronomical military aid that Ukraine needs to secure a decisive victory. I don't think that that's right. Okay, so here's, I highlighted a few things. You judge. There's no doubt that Russia finishes 2022 campaign with a bitter taste in its mouth and a massive sense of disappointment. Strategically, Russia finds itself increasingly isolated, though the actual sanctions regime is being supported by only about 50 nations. Sanctions don't work. I've talked about that before. It has some effect, some long-term effect, but it wasn't in itself going to drive them to their knees. A little bit further, operationally, the 2022 campaign did not meet its likely targets, or its key targets. Western assistance provided them, that's the Ukrainians, with core capabilities they couldn't have dreamed of prior to the war. They are now more integrated into NATO's command, coordination, and information sharing networks than ever. Ukrainian forces have gained invaluable combat experience, and that's very true, allowing them to claim back parts of their country occupied by Russia. Okay. But he concludes in this way, and I thought, this is wrong-headed. The Russian economy is becoming increasingly militarized and converted to supporting a long-term war effort. That's true. But when you compare what Russia will be able to do in their long-term war machine effort as opposed to what the West can bring to the table, it's really no contest. Its resilience to sanctions was underestimated. Again, I said this, I did a whole extra video about how sanctions, they just don't do what you would hope that they would do. And there's gradual realization that defeating Russia on the battlefield may not be possible. I don't think that that's correct. I think that that's wrong. I think they will defeat Russia on the battlefield. It will be a matter of time, and it'll take some more bludgeoning. But there's a reason, and there's some good reasons why they're not. This is one, and I'm only going to read one line from this, but this is one of the primary reasons. Putin routinely bombards the Ukrainian civilian population because he knows he faces no danger of retaliation. The West appears paralyzed by its fear of Russian escalation. That's right. Putin's not worried about, like, he can send 100 missiles into Ukraine because Ukraine's not sending 100 missiles back at him. He doesn't have to worry about what's going to happen when electric's out in Moscow, or what will it look like when the Kremlin gets hit. He's not thinking that at all. So he's got this huge mental advantage about how everything's okay on his end, but it's not okay on his end. So here's the ISW, and I want to show you a couple of things that are just going wrong on his end. Reports of poorly staffed, provisioned, and supplied Russian mobilized personnel are dividing the Russian information space. There's the official line, and then there's mill bloggers who are in Russia's corner saying, look, this isn't working. What you're doing here, it's not okay. Russian President Vladimir Putin, I talked about this yesterday, falsely presented a meeting with 18 handpicked women holding influential positions in the Russian political sphere, as well as an open discussion with mothers of mobilized personnel. Now, it was on RT and Pravda so he's meeting with these mothers and they're saying, I'm scared for my 17-year-old son that he'll be mobilized. And he's saying, no, we don't need any more mobilization. There's nothing to worry about. It's all whatever. Now, these were, as somebody pointed out in my comments, these are actors. These aren't actual mothers. They may have been mothers, but they're there for the theatrics of Putin being able to say confidently and calmly, look, there's nothing to see here. Don't worry about it. We have it under control. It's all political theater. But this is what I was really driving at of why I think he's in a hole. An investigation by Forum's Ukrainian service revealed the extent of financial strain that the war in Ukraine has imposed on Russia's annual budget. Forbes found that Russia has spent $82 billion on the first 9 months of the war in Ukraine, amounting to 1/4 of its entire 2021 annual budget of $340 billion. So they can't keep this up for so long. I mean, this is just a terrible strain. 1/4 of your annual budget is it's astronomical. And so I think they're being hurt even as they're hurting. I mean, nobody's actually better off today than they were yesterday after missile strikes, but certainly the people getting hit by missiles are worse off, but the people shooting the $1 million to $2 million missiles at a time are far worse off as well. So nobody's really like winning in that scenario, but Russia's being hurt as much as, or far more than it's letting on. So that's what's going on the ground there. I hope that helps you understand some greater perspective of what's going on in Ukraine. If this has helped you, please hit like so that it tells the YouTube algorithm to spread it. Thank you for your time, and thank you for being the kind of person that cares about Ukraine.